Hello, hello.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. How's your day?
Pretty amazing. It's all we're like in what Snowmageddon right now.
Oh, but
So I'm still like suffering the residual impacts of all this snow that is around us.
it's actually
Uh,
alarming. I don't think I've seen this much snow since
no,
actually ever. Yeah.
ever. It's a lot. It's too much. It's too much.
And we do not have the infrastructure.
But that's the part that shocks me constantly is that we live in a country where it's not like winter happened for the first time this time around.
Yeah, totally.
But it feels that way like every single time because it's just like all the systems fail and you're like, how does this make any sense?
Yeah, just we're always on the
I was actually watching a video about the myth of winter,
precipice.
tying into a lot of mythology elements here. But the idea that, winter only exists because those are the months in which Persephone is not with her mother.
Yeah, totally.
And so this idea that because she had the six pomegranate seeds, we have six prolonged months of winter the entire time. That is, it's what I would call Greek science, where you're using myth to explain a lot of the happenings of the world.
Yeah, totally. Like that one.
Yeah, it's very, very crazy. It's very, very crazy, but very tied to a lot of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so, maybe what would be a really good idea is to kind of start off by telling us a little bit about who you are at this point in time, because, we're evolving people. We're different people at different points in time, but who are you now? Who are you today?
Yeah. So I always probably introduce myself now first and foremost as a writer because
Okay.
it's an overarching kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. I primarily develop my writing right now through poetry, but I've been working on some more extensive material. I would probably surmise them as like poetic essays that I'm
Okay.
hoping to publish by the end of the year. It's an anthology of sorts. That will
Nice.
be entitled Blue Myth.
Yeah.
So that's the work I'm working towards at this point.
Mhm.
But yeah, just putting towards kind of like the overarching ambition of creating a beautiful object and that
Yeah.
object being a book, because books to me in my own practice have been so sacred
Mhm.
that I think as artists or people who have creative impulses, we always look towards others and see like, oh, idealistically, who would I want to be like? And
Yeah.
time and time again, I found myself wanting the life of a writer, and
Mhm.
those being the people I ultimately strive towards being. And I think, yeah, that's how I choose to
Yeah.
describe myself, even though I think in any
I,
profession or in any field, one has a certain amount of imposter syndrome. But
no, imposter syndrome is real though. I mean,
totally,
it's very much a thing. But I do know the value that books hold to you because one of my favorite, anecdotal moments involving you is finding you on Blur, leaving the BMV in the summer
yeah,
with all these books in your hand, and then literally just asking you like, what was the entire point of this journey? And you're literally just like, I just want to go out and get these books. And I was like, this is literally what he leaves the house for.
totally.
But you know what? I feel like there is a beauty in literature. One of the things that I did a lot when I was younger, and in fact, one of the things I did one of my degrees in is literature.
Oh,
I love writing. I love any form of written media. And though I'm not actively reading as much now, I think what motivated me more when I was younger was really this strange connection that I had to written work that I don't think, it doesn't resonate for me the same way maybe that other forms of art do, because it has a more ethereal feel to it. There's something
totally. Well,
otherworldly
the
about
written
it.
word is so intimate in that when you are reading, you're ultimately
Yeah,
creating consciousness in your head of those words.
exactly.
So like there's
Exactly.
such a dynamic relationship just by that
Hmm.
act alone, because it
Hmm.
also requires of you so much participation in that reading is
Yes.
almost a form of meditation, in that it's forced
Hmm.
concentration on a
Yeah.
line after line after line. So
Yeah.
ultimately it really is an act. So I
Hmm.
think that's what separates reading from from other media just generally, by virtue of its active participation that it requires of you. It's all,
100%. And
it in no
it's
way is
the,
passive. You have to focus.
no, you do. I feel like one of the more interactive forms of
Mm.
actually engaging with anything. And I think it gives you a lot more than, that you give back to it. The
Oh yeah,
value of it, I think, is infinite.
yeah.
And, one of the things I was actually very curious to know from you, at least, is, why do you create? Like, what make do you want to start creating and writing and connecting to people in this way?
Yeah, I think it's just back to that idea of I
Mm-hmm.
always had an envision of myself as looking in search of the words that
Mm-hmm.
I found that comfort in that
Yeah.
dynamic act of reading. And I think as one expands one's knowledge in literature just generally, you find those voices that ultimately resonate with your own.
Mm-hmm.
And in a form that's like it becomes like a mirror. They
Yeah.
ultimately become a means for you to look within and introspect. And I
Mm-hmm.
found that through finding those other voices and just consuming so much literature over a
Mm-hmm.
period of time where I just invested in it, that I ultimately found sort of my own voice. And
Yeah.
being that voice for myself ultimately is just an affirmation of who I am at this point in
Mm-hmm.
my life, at this period of time.
Yeah.
I'm sort of just writing that person into existence, if you will.
No, I really love that. And I feel like it genuinely feels that way when I do read your work. I think that a lot of it is you. I
Mhm.
also feel like I see you in a very different way. I know you personally, but I also feel like through your work, I know you even more personally. And I think that those are sides to who you are as a person that, maybe I don't immediately get to see because maybe the context is not calling for us to engage in that way.
Totally.
And I think that that's the beauty of writing too. I also think there's a little bit of preservation of you in a moment in time when you write, which I also
Mm,
really love because I feel like maybe you are different people at every point in time that you've written. And
mm,
that's reflected in your work too,
totally.
which I think is really powerful because then it becomes sort of like, a little bit of your biography is in
Yeah,
your
it
work.
becomes a record, if you will,
It
just of
really becomes
everything.
a record,
I
you
mean,
know?
that's like probably a leftover from like the legal career I once had and
Hmm.
working away. I think
Yeah.
I studied law and ultimately do practice law, and that ultimately led me to a love of language
Hmm.
because law at its most basic form is strictly an interrogation of language and meaning.
Yeah.
So I really, really through that kind of just like you explored just there, just an exploration of a record to leave a
Hmm.
trail, and that record ultimately making oneself up. And I think that's the mythological imperative of writing.
Yeah.
Like overarching for a lot of writers and a lot of people, just
Hmm.
creating a persona to build oneself around, I think is really just a fascinating thing to do generally as a creative person.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, you spoke a little bit about the idea that there is a little bit of a mythological element to what it is you're creating. I think when you are creating a narrative of any kind, especially of yourself, and you're building this mythology of who you are, there's like, for me at least, there are two elements to mythology that I feel like really, maybe remind me the most of it when I read any form of folklore. I'm like, this is mythology because there's a sense of preservation to what it is. There's a sense
Mhm.
of relevance to what it is, right? It speaks to a moment in time. But it's a moment in time that also perseveres in its understanding.
And it's obsessive.
Um, yeah. And so, part of you always wondered, like, why was it so important for you to build a mythology around not just yourself? I also feel like it's about your community and who's around you. But why
Mm.
was it so important for you to build this mythology?
Yeah, maybe because like I didn't necessarily always see myself reflected
Mm-hmm.
in the larger canon of myth, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But if one interrogates them more deeply, I think, than a surface level,
Mm.
I think they ultimately speak to humanity writ large,
Yeah.
and it invites us all to become part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a firm believer that one's memories are really just a myth because we're not ever grounded in some sort of vacuum of objective reality. We're
Mm-hmm.
all stricken with our own lens and bias through which we are constantly perceiving ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And through a set of circumstances, we're formulating this identity that
Yeah.
we ultimately comprise as the self. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm very fascinated by the notion of the further distance we get from memories, or how we can recast them or re-perceive them, and use that subject matter as the source material for our own mythology. And I think that's what all myths invite us to do from their most basic function, is to just examine life, serve a pedagogical function, in that it's there to teach one about what it is to be human and what it is to be human in the context that one finds themselves. So that's
absolutely.
ultimately always trying to explore, and really hoping that my work serves as an invitation for others to do the same in their own lives.
I like that a lot. I feel like because that is the power of mythology, in that the interpretation is really more contextual to who's consuming it.
Totally. And that's the beauty of folklore too, in that when you heard those great stories, there was always a different version of them. And that's largely because they were grounded in oral traditions where everyone got a little detail or a little nuance different. And those little nuances ultimately do kind of speak to a larger sort of context in which everything comes from. And I think that's sort of the very fabric. Every story ever told speaks to your own tale, I would say.
I think it really does. And I think it really allows you that avenue to understand the world in something. It kind of gives you the rudimentary tools to sort of understand certain things, Totally. And I think that is its greatest gift to you. One thing I really love too is that you do talk a lot about your own community, about elements of your community in there. Why is it important for you to preserve parts of your community through your work, in this way? Because you are also building a mythology for your community.
Yeah, and I want the people in my community, or people who come from a background such as my own, to ultimately see themselves, I guess, cast in that light. I think it's important because we don't really have all of these scripts for queer people existing in the world, or existing in the 21st century. So I think it's important to kind of have a record of what that looks like, and maybe for ultimately any human being to see themselves in it.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really great as a gift to leave people. I think that's going to make one of the biggest impacts in a lot of ways. One thing I really liked too as well is that, you are on a journey in your writing, but you also have been on a journey to discover a lot of who you are. That also comes into your work a lot. What do you feel about this journey that you've been on, whether it's recent or in the past, most deeply has impacted you in terms of, this has actually changed you and how you are?
That's a good question. I mean, there's so many things, and that's kind of like ultimately what I seek to explore in this first work, in this first book that I'm putting together, is like a creation myth of sorts, of those perspectives or those points in existing that have sort of led me down this trail. But I mean, I think it's ultimately something an impulse that you're drawn towards from a very young age, and you ultimately feel a creative calling sort of when you're young. And I sort of maybe would say I definitely turned away from that in a sense of turning away from sort of my own identity at times, whereas we put these things in sort of confining boxes. And I guess sort of through my own experience and through own personal losses and just fundamental changes in such a short period of time, I've kind of seen that life is very fleeting and brief, and I have to act on these impulses while I have the ability to do such, or else I will live a life just completely in regret. And I just don't want to, didn't want to do that anymore. It became too great a cost to avoid that I couldn't turn away from it anymore.
I think that's really pivotal for you in a lot of ways, because I think when I read some of your work, there are elements of you processing your grief and your reconciling a lot of that in your work. How important was it for you to be able to write in order to process grief as a whole?
Oh, totally. Yeah, writing is like, it's almost like in and of itself the means of salvation, because like the practice of alleviating myself from what's going on, or ultimately composing my emotions into structure, is in and of itself what sort of rescues me from all of the grief and all of the goings on in life. So that's kind of why it's so pivotal to me, in that like it's not only a practice with which I can share my creativity, it's both a practice with which I am able to stay sane in essence. So I really wish for other people to kind of have an outlet or anything that alleviates the burden of being alive at points. But like having that definitely has changed me fundamentally.
I think it's really key because I feel like a lot of people, we live in such a weird world right now where there is just so much. And it becomes really hard to kind of understand any of it because it's just so overwhelming. And then trying to put that understanding on what's already so overwhelming makes it even more overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
Crisis averted. There's no crisis. I feel like if your family is not calling you, something's very wrong.
And I got 2 calls a day from the sister and 3 calls a day from my mother. So
yeah, that's necessary. It's necessary. One other thing that I was actually very curious to know too is, in terms of grief, what is grief for you? There is this entire sad boy persona that exists, that's there. And I'm very curious to know a little bit about it because no, it's not to knock it in any way. I think that there's a lot of truth, there's a lot of insight that lies in that alone. But a lot of it is about processing grief. It's a lot about talking about different forms of grief. So, maybe you can give us a little bit of insight into that element and what that's like.
I just think that grief is very universal. Like I'm not alone in having a life that has grief present in it. Right. I think we've kind of are always trying to cleanse ourselves of the uncomfortableness of grief in our lives in any form that it comes in rejection, in loss. Ultimately, everyone will lose somebody that they love very dearly. That is just a natural part of existing. And I just found it to a point where we just put up such a facade when it comes to it, where especially as a man, like being born male, that assigns a lot of sort of expectation in that we're not allowed to express those emotions.
Right.
And I think that's truly a peril that we're seeing played out on such a large scale, in that people generally do not know how to process grief or how to explore their grief or how to give language to their grief, which I think is really, really important for the world, just generally. Again,
100%. And this is why I said it's really insightful that you are this way, because I think you are vocalizing and you are verbalizing a lot of what it is that is grief. And I think for a lot of people, that's really hard, right? Like you carry grief within you, but then how that manifests can be in so many different forms, right?
Absolutely.
And it's because you don't have an outlet to maybe kind of explain or try to talk to people about why it is that you are feeling a certain way or why it is something's happening to you.
Yeah, or definitely I think, back to those scripts. Don't have that language or those ideas. You can exist with multitudes inside you. You can exist
100%
carrying that with you and still experience joy at times. You can exist and go about your day. It's just, I always found the idea of the masks that we live behind to be very, very fascinating. And just the humanity that we leave out when we put on these personas towards the world, and what that comes at, really.
One thing that I actually was very curious to know too from you is, there is a vulnerability that is required of you, not just in your writing, but it's also in you now presenting this writing to us as an audience. What does that journey look like for you, and how have you overcome, being able to kind of say, this is a very vulnerable part of me and I'm okay to put it out there? What was that conversation like with yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely takes years to overcome, for sure. Especially because writing, I mean, any form of creative expression entails a degree of vulnerability in terms of you're putting yourself out there to be as an offering, to be sort of criticized. You're putting yourself out there to people's interpretation. You're putting yourself out there. But I think at a certain point, you just get over the notion of the how it's going to be perceived, and
Right.
you sort of just do it for the reasons that we stated earlier, in that like it is a degree of alleviation to have an outlet to be able to process these emotions with. That like I do it for that, or
Yeah.
it is a degree of like salvation in that like I'm making sense of the world, so I do it for that, and those emotions become bigger than the perception that other people will have of it.
Yeah.
And that
No, that's
ultimately
true.
just falls away, and really, you just,
It's true.
yeah, you can't really care what other people think. Like, it's just,
No, you can't. And I feel like, when we begin to do that, we stop doing everything else. And I think that is really such an impediment for a lot of us. But one of the things I think that was really cool was that, when you are presenting your work now to people, because you are sometimes doing this to a live audience, for example, I'm assuming you do get a lot of that immediate feedback. And so you are getting to see the impact maybe that your work is having on people.
totally. Oh my God,
right? Yeah.
I mean, presenting a poem live is definitely a feat in and of itself, like, or just an experience in and of itself, because it is ultimately about communing with somebody in that presentation. But yeah, you definitely get feedback, and people in audiences think they have a degree of anonymity to how they're expressing, but you can see people's immediate feedback and their reception on their faces. Like, you can't hide that in somebody understanding or resonating with something, or it's just ultimately all worn. So like, I find that experience of it to be very valuable in terms of presenting works that way.
Absolutely. And I think it's also like, you're putting a face to a lot of what people initially, if they just read your work, they only are assuming is the face, which I really love. A lot of authors did not get to do that. So that's kind of really key.
Yeah.
If you were to give any piece of advice for someone that wants to start off writing, what would your kind of one piece of advice be?
If you want to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader, I would say. So,
yeah.
And then in terms of writing, it's a skill like anything else. The only way you're going to get good at it is if you constantly practice it. So just work on it.
Working on it.
And you don't have to make these endeavors so grand, I would say. That would be another piece of advice. That like, just make it small. Like, it doesn't have to be a novel that's going to change the world, or a poem that's going to be the next great American classic. It's just start exactly where you are.
No, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I think you have to start somewhere. It might as well be small, but putting something out there is the first step. Any authors you recommend people should read?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it depends on ultimately what you want to read. Because like a lot of people like fiction. For instance, my favorite kind of book is memoir. So like I read constant books, memoirs. Like that's what I revolve around literally. Also, obviously, recently I read a lot of poetry because that's the means to which I express myself. I've been reading a lot of the classics lately, as to kind of put my mind towards the own works that I've been working on right now. So yeah, but I would also say, just explore the classics. That's kind of where people are always intimidated by those works, I would say.
Yeah.
But like, they're great for a reason. And like, you don't need to read like a textbook on the thing. Just like go right to the primary. If you're interested in like Greek philosophy, like go read some Plato and Aristotle. Like, it's very digestible, that material, and make your own opinions of things. Like, don't necessarily have to rely on other things. Like, I guess that.
It's like that is very accurate. Like that. It actually like literally sounds like an echo to what my professor would tell me all the time. Because when you were writing, for example, when you're writing your first play, and I wrote my first play as part of my dissertation, that play, the structure of a lot of the plays that you'll end up writing has already been established, right? There's a reason that these things exist the way that they exist. And those are just foundational blocks. Now, what you're going to build on top of that, that's where your perspective comes in. But the structure, the base level elements of it already exist and they're already kind of like tried, true, and vetted.
You don't have
So
to
why?
reinvent the wheel. You don't have to.
No, you really don't.
Yeah.
Honestly, you don't. And I feel like any kind of innovation comes from everything else that you're going to apply to what
Totally.
already exists,
And like
right?
all of it is just a
Mm.
matter of like every writer is just a
Mm.
summation of every book they've ever read. Like
100%.
it's just about taking
100%.
those influences and
Yeah.
making them your own. And that
Mhm.
act of making those influences your own is your
Mhm.
writing. So like that's your art
Mhm.
right there. And definitely people overcomplicate that all the time. Definitely.
I mean, but that is also human nature too, to
Yeah.
want to do that. In terms
You
of
gotta
what's
keep-
next for you,
you
where are
gotta
you
keep
going
the mystery
next?
up. What am I doing next?
Mhm.
What I'm doing next is like really,
Something?
I hope by the summer to have my book completed and self-publishing it as like a piece of art.
Yeah.
I really just want to publish like an edition of maybe 50 of them as like a really beautiful, like bound book of an epic poem of sorts of my own and a collection of my works that I've created thus far. That will be titled Blue Myth. So that's what the next iteration is working towards.
Yeah, I'm excited to actually meet the Blue Myth in its new form, which is going to be very exciting. Where can people find you now?
Best place to find me now would be Instagram, Silvio-Tonie, and then I have a website. It's all linked on my Instagram, so just go through there.
Yeah, I'll share the links too as well.
And
no, this was super, super insightful, Silvio.
Thank you. This is so much fun.
No, I've honestly been so curious about all of it. I think you know it. I periodically DM you random things and photos of blue things a lot of the time.
I know, I actually miss you. We gotta hang out soon.
We should. We absolutely should. And we will. Okay, this is really, really good. We're going to do this after Blue Myth comes out. This is the plan. Because I want to know what happened post.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Oh my God.
So that I can actually see how much of it actually changed you.
And then I'll have really like a couple, like I have like mock-ups of like everything. Like I'm like very like prepared. Like I know what the book's gonna look like.
You are one of the few people that I actively see still using a little notebook.
I write pen paper every day. Like that's every like day. How I need to start the day. Like
no, it's important. I feel like getting it down in that physical process.
Even like my to-dos, I'm so analog. Like I need everything written out, or else nothing gets or else it's literal chaos.
I'll send you this. I'll send you a little clip later. But it's Joanna Lumley talking about the fact that she writes an email on paper first before typing it out.
Oh my God, yeah.
It's because of what the process of actually like putting a pen to paper does for her mind, that she cannot do that on a computer. Like she has the hardest time reconciling that.
It literally is that though.
Awesome. Well, very nice chatting with you, and we will do this again in next season.
Okay.